So, brilliant. So today, as David said, I'm going to be talking a bit about obstructive sleep apnea and Parkinson's disease, and I'll be introducing the CPAP PD study, which the Sleep Research Unit at the Department of Sleep Medicine are hoping to start running in the very near future. So just to introduce myself and Dr. Renata Riha, who is here, the chief investigator, so that you can get an idea of our backgrounds and where we're coming from with this work. So Renata, as David said, is a consultant in sleep and respiratory medicine at the Royal Infirmary with over 20 years of experience in sleep medicine. And outside of the clinic, she is also an incredibly prolific researcher. So her research interests span every corner of sleep medicine, with also experience in sleep and neurological conditions, again in biomarkers with Parkinson's disease. And she's the chief editor of the European Respiratory Review and has literally written the book on sleep. So it's a fantastic book, Sleep, Your Questions Answered, and just anything you can think about with sleep. It's got some great information in it. And myself, I'm coming at this from more the Parkinson's side as opposed to the obstructive sleep apnea side. And as David said, I'm nearly very close to having my PhD finished. So I've just got my defense to go in a couple of months' time. But I was in Bristol with its beautiful suspension bridge, looking at REM sleep behavior disorder. So this is a condition that I'm sure some of you here will be familiar with because it has quite deep ties with Parkinson's disease and the synuclein neurodegenerative conditions. So normally when we're in REM sleep and we're dreaming, our skeletal muscles, so our arms and legs, are paralyzed. And what this means is that when we're dreaming and we're sort of having all these thoughts about active movements, we don't act them out. And that's very evolutionarily advantageous. If you think about, a monkey in a tree having a dream, if they were then to start acting it out, they might fall and hurt themselves. And that's kind of the same principle with human beings and sleep and dreaming. However, for some people, such as the person in this video, when they're in REM sleep, so they're dreaming, they've got these rapid eye movements. You see they start having these twitches going in their arms and in their toes. And it develops into a very big active movement with some punching and kicking. And this person stays asleep throughout. And as you can see, they go back to sleep, or they continue to be asleep. And so REM sleep behavior disorder can happen many years before Parkinson's, or it can also happen at the same time as a Parkinson's diagnosis. So there's a connection there with neurodegeneration in the brain. And so that's the angle I'm coming into this from. And as David said, my PhD was looking at predicting which people who have this REM sleep behavior disorder, shown in the yellow, predicting whether they would or wouldn't develop Parkinson's disease. And from doing that research, I learned a few things, which is that sleep is incredibly important for general health and well-being. I'm sure, again, I don't need to convince anyone of this. When you have a bad night's sleep, you feel absolutely awful the next day, and it's very hard to focus. And also that sleep problems are very common in Parkinson's disease. So I was looking specifically at this REM sleep behavior disorder, but with the participants in my study who had Parkinson's, actually people would complain of, cramps in the night and waking up a lot and going to the toilet a lot. So this is a massive thing in Parkinson's disease, but it doesn't receive the attention it deserves, I think. So obviously a lot of research and a lot of treatment focuses on the motor symptoms of Parkinson's, which are incredibly impactful, and definitely they need to be addressed. But the non-motor symptoms are incredibly common. So things like sleep issues and depression and cognitive symptoms, and they don't sometimes get addressed in quite the same way. So all this comes to say that, yes, sleep problems are very common. There's a whole range of sleep problems that affect people with Parkinson's disease. But one of them, which is perhaps overlooked, is obstructive sleep apnea, which is what the focus of the rest of the talk and the research project I'm introducing is on. So obstructive sleep apnea, I'm sure also everyone here is vaguely familiar with this condition, or the name of it at least, probably the treatment of it, but you might not know actually what's happening. So normally when we're sleeping and we're breathing, we've got air that comes in through the nose and mouth, goes to the back of the throat, down into the lungs, and we take a nice big breath. But with obstructive sleep apnea, what happens is this upper airway at the back of the throat actually closes from time to time, so it's intermittent. So sometimes we will have these, normal breathing patterns, and then the upper airway will close and the air cannot go down to the lungs. And that's the obstruction, is that sort of closure. The clinical signs of this are these breathing pauses that happen because of the closure, and this is what the apnea is called. And then we also get shallow breathing. So the breathing pauses and shallow breathing then lead to low blood oxygen levels because you're just not taking in that oxygen. Definitely with the breathing pauses, what then happens is we get these micro awakenings. So people sort of wake up very briefly and then go back to sleep, and they're not aware of these awakenings, but their sleep then becomes incredibly fragmented. So normally in sleep, you want to be getting consolidated periods where you can go into all the different stages of sleep. But with obstructive sleep apnea, this gets interrupted again and again and again. And people can have breathing pauses from, sort of 2 an hour that might happen to over 100 an hour. So the severity of the obstructive sleep apnea really varies. And what all of this causes, the low blood oxygen levels, the fragmented sleep, is local and systemic inflammation. So we get inflammation actually in the airway because of this, but we also then get inflammation affecting a whole host of different parts of the body because of this disrupted oxygen and sleep. And when you have obstructive sleep apnea and it's untreated, it leads to an increased risk of cardiovascular disease, metabolic diseases like diabetes, and also of stroke. So it's incredibly important to recognize obstructive sleep apnea and to treat it. Now, for some people who have obstructive sleep apnea, it's not just happening, it happens in the night, but they also feel the effects in the daytime, and they get associated daytime symptoms. So because their sleep is fragmented, they get really tired, and it's called excessive daytime sleepiness. So they feel like they need to nap all the time. People can also get headaches, especially when they wake up in the morning. And mood dysregulation is quite a big thing. So like I said before, when you've got a bad night's sleep and then you feel really grumpy and irritable, these people will have. And then memory and cognitive problems as well, because you're so tired and the blood oxygen levels are intermittently low. So all of this compounds together into quite a detrimental condition for people. And when you have obstructive sleep apnea happening at night, and you get these associated daytime symptoms, some or all of them, this is what's called obstructive sleep apnea hypopnea syndrome. So it's a constellation of lots of different symptoms all linked together. And what causes obstructive sleep apnea? Like most conditions, there are modifiable causes of it. So these are things which our actions can impact in some way. So obesity is a big one, with fat accumulation around the neck. Alcohol use and smoking, taking sedative medications like sleeping pills, which might then relax the airways and cause this closure to happen. And also nasal congestion can cause obstructive sleep apnea. There's also non-modifiable things that cause it. So people's ethnicity, perhaps, being a man, you're more likely to have obstructive sleep apnea. Being older, going through the menopause and the hormone changes that happen, and also the craniofacial structure, so the actual structure of the skull and all the sort of airways and things can contribute to obstructive sleep apnea. So all of these things are basically risk factors. And in the general population, obstructive sleep apnea worldwide is estimated to affect 12% of people. And obviously it depends on a country's ability to actually detect the condition, have the equipment to then, use in people and figure out that they have obstructive sleep apnea. And because of all these modifiable and non-modifiable factors, it really depends on the age, the well-being, the demographics of the actual population in a country as to how prevalent or common obstructive sleep apnea is. And in the UK, 15 to 25% of people are estimated to have some degree of obstructive sleep apnea. So it's quite high, 1 in 4 at the upper end. But because obstructive sleep apnea, people don't always have those daytime symptoms. And so for many people, they're not aware that they're actually having this, and they might feel, like their sleep is a bit disturbed, but they don't really know why. And because they're not aware they have it, they don't go to the doctor, so it's underdiagnosed in the general population. And like I said, there's a lot of risk factors, or obstructive sleep apnea can lead to other conditions, but it can be treated really effectively, and that can really minimize the sort of bad effects of the condition. So probably the gold standard of treatment is the positive airway pressure machines. So you've probably heard of CPAP, which is continuous positive airway pressure. And these are these machines that look like this. They just sit on the bedside table, and they've got a tube which connects from the machine over to the person sleeping and to their airway. So these are incredibly effective, and this is the treatment that our study actually is going to focus on. Another way of treating obstructive sleep apnea is by tackling those modifiable causes of it. So lifestyle change, getting people to exercise more, losing weight, reducing their alcohol consumption and their smoking. All of these things can help to reduce the severity of obstructive sleep apnea. However, again, as I'm sure many people appreciate, lifestyle change can be a lot harder than, just saying, great, lose some weight. It is a bit harder. So the positive airway pressure machines are fantastic for getting people to have good sleep, even with obstructive sleep apnea. So why does Parkinson's come into all of this? Why are we interested in this? Well, obstructive sleep apnea in people with Parkinson's disease is actually estimated to be quite high, so it's quite common. Estimates range between 20 to 65%. So that lower range is definitely within the UK's estimated range of OSA. However, 65% is a lot higher. So lots of studies do find that obstructive sleep apnea seems to be more common in people with Parkinson's. And it's a bit of a mystery why. There's lots of theories. So there's some theories that the Parkinson's disease is responsible for the obstructive sleep apnea. So the Parkinson's is changing the way that people are breathing in the night, and therefore they're more likely to have this sleep disordered breathing. So the dopaminergic degeneration of Parkinson's disease and also the serotonin neurons can degenerate. And dopamine and serotonin neurotransmitters are both responsible for regulating the airway patency and the muscle coordination of breathing during sleep. So that could be one reason why, because these neurons are affected in Parkinson's. Therefore, we see a bit of a change happening. There's also autonomic dysregulation. So the fight or flight response gets a bit flipped, a bit altered in Parkinson's, and autonomic regulation of breathing is impactful. Mouth breathing, so certainly in later stages of Parkinson's, where the mouth is open a bit more, then mouth breathing during the night can also contribute to obstructive sleep apnea. And as I'm sure people here appreciate, is that Parkinson's disease does not look the same in two people. So everyone has slightly different symptoms happening at different times, different severities. And so this might be the reason why we get such a range of estimates of how common obstructive sleep apnea is, because in one study, they might have people with Parkinson's who all have a tremor and all have obstructive sleep apnea. In another, it might be people who not many have obstructive sleep apnea. So there's lots of there's just the profile of Parkinson's might be causing this variability. Of course, the other thing which ties Parkinson's disease and obstructive sleep apnea together is that they're both more common as you get older. So it might be that simply in Parkinson's disease, we've got an older population, and so they're more likely to have obstructive sleep apnea. However, still in studies, when they compare age-matched controls, so sort of people without Parkinson's with people with Parkinson's disease, the people with Parkinson's do tend to have a higher obstructive sleep apnea rate. So potentially it's older age, but there's still some possible Parkinson's mechanism. On the flip side, some research suggests that inflammation which happens because of obstructive sleep apnea might actually be a risk factor for Parkinson's to develop in the first place. So in these studies, they've shown that people who have obstructive sleep apnea on its own are more likely to develop Parkinson's. So that might be the direction of the relationship. And then, of course, like all research, there's the potential for methodological issues. So the study, who gets chosen to participate in the study, you might just end up with more people who have obstructive sleep apnea in the Parkinson's group. Nevertheless, with such a high estimated number of people with Parkinson's, there aren't many people with Parkinson's who get referred to the Department of Sleep Medicine for obstructive sleep apnea investigation. So some of the reasons for this is that daytime sleepiness, fatigue, and nocturia, so going to pee in the night, these are really common Parkinson's symptoms. So when you go to the clinic and you complain of feeling sleepy in the day or going to the loo a lot, the clinicians or the healthcare staff might just go, oh, it's because of the Parkinson's. And so they don't consider that it could be because of obstructive sleep apnea. Because of this, people with Parkinson's don't routinely go on to be screened for the obstructive sleep apnea. And therefore, it's likely that obstructive sleep apnea is underdiagnosed in people with Parkinson's disease. So that's very similar with the general population. It's just that the reason why the underdiagnosis happens is a bit different. So even if we've got loads, a very high number of people with Parkinson's have obstructive sleep apnea, why does it matter? For many people, the Parkinson's disease is the priority. That's the thing to get under control and to live well with. However, we've seen that obstructive sleep apnea on its own comes with a whole host of other risks, so for diabetes or for stroke. So in itself, it's important to treat it. But beyond that, research shows that people who have Parkinson's disease and obstructive sleep apnea, their Parkinson's disease symptoms are actually worse than people with Parkinson's without the obstructive sleep apnea. And if you have OSA and Parkinson's disease, people report poorer quality of life. So more issues, more depression. So for the general well-being of people with their Parkinson's, it's important to identify and treat the obstructive sleep apnea. And the great news is that this CPAP therapy, so that pressurized, the positive airway pressure that I talked about before, the machine, if you treat people with Parkinson's who have obstructive sleep apnea using that CPAP machine, not only does their obstructive sleep apnea severity and their symptoms improve, but their Parkinson's disease symptoms can improve. And that includes motor, so the movement symptoms, and non-motor symptoms like depression and cognition. So they're not the most interesting graphs, I apologize. The studies from these haven't done any nice jazzy colourful graphs, but I've got a couple just to show you to try and emphasize this point. So on this graph on the left, this is looking at the motor score, so the UPDRS. I'm sure that everyone here has done it. You're tapping your fingers, you're stamping your feet. And we have at the bottom starting, if we look at the time point 0 here, this is over a 12-month study. At time point 0, we've got this dotted line which goes up. And these are people who have Parkinson's, but they do not have obstructive sleep apnea. And you can see over 12 months, their score and the UPDRS, the motor, it goes from just below 20, and over 12 months, it increases to just over 26 score. So that's an increase of 6 points. And this is, typical progression of Parkinson's disease. In the group next above, so actually these two lines above are people who have Parkinson's with obstructive sleep apnea. And the difference is that half of them were given a CPAP machine and half of them weren't. So in the first instance, you can see that both of the groups, their score is already higher. Their motor symptoms are worse than the people with Parkinson's who don't have obstructive sleep apnea. And we see there's this dashed line. And so this is the group who have obstructive sleep apnea, but they did not receive CPAP therapy. And so you can see that over 12 months, their motor score also increases. So their movement problems get worse over 12 months. But then if you look above, we've got this line, which is it's a straight filled in line. This is the group who have Parkinson's with obstructive sleep apnea, and they received CPAP therapy. So their starting point on the score is highest. And so in this study, that's why they received the CPAP therapy. They were the people with the worst obstructive sleep apnea. But then if you go across over the 12-month duration, their motor score is stable. It isn't changing. And so that's very interesting that the obstructive sleep apnea treatment might be interacting in some way with the Parkinson's mechanisms of motor symptoms. The next very grey graph, again, I apologize, is from a study in 2018 by Kaminska. And these are two non-motor symptoms. So on the left, or the middle panel now, we've got the MOCA. So this is the Montreal Cognitive Assessment. Again, if you've taken part in research, it's likely you've done this. You have to name some animals. You've got to count backwards, I think from 100 in multiples of 7. There's lots of different cognitive tests to get you thinking. And again, we've got 3 groups. We've got in black, a group of people with Parkinson's who do not have obstructive sleep apnea. And then in the grey bars, we've got people with obstructive sleep apnea who received CPAP therapy, and that's the light grey in the middle. And then people with obstructive sleep apnea who did not receive CPAP therapy, and that's in the dark grey. And so what we see that over 12 months, the people who received the CPAP therapy, their cognitive score improved over 12 months. So that's good. Their cognitive function is improving with the therapy. And then on the far right here, we've got the UPDRS1, which is a sort of all-encompassing non-motor symptoms of Parkinson's. question. And we can see that again, in the group which received the CPAP therapy, their UPDRS score decreases significantly compared to the other groups over the 12-month period. And so that means that their Parkinson's symptoms got better. They were less impactful, so their score decreases. So this is really compelling evidence and very interesting to consider the fact how obstructive sleep apnea is interacting with Parkinson's symptoms when you might think that they don't. But to date, these studies, there's only been a few of them. They haven't been randomized controlled trials. They're often opportunistic. People are given the CPAP therapy sort of as and when. And so, although it's very promising, there's not sort of a gold standard study of looking at CPAP therapy in people with Parkinson's disease who have obstructive sleep apnea or the obstructive sleep apnea syndrome with the daytime sleepiness. And so our research team is proposing a randomized control trial to do just this. So the long title, they're never very user-friendly, I think, and, whatever. But the long title of the study is, does continuous positive airway pressure, CPAP, improve symptoms of Parkinson's disease in people with Parkinson's with sleep apnea? So it's a randomized controlled trial. Half of the people are given CPAP, half of the people are not. And this is in people who have Parkinson's with obstructive sleep apnea. So the research team, chief investigator, as I've already introduced, is Dr. Renata Riha. Myself and Stevie Williams, a colleague, are the sort of researchers on the ground. And we have David Breen, who I'm sure many of you know, as a collaborator who has really helped with sort of advising on the project. And we've got support from the clinical research facility. So the research will take place there. Again, if you've taken part in research, you're probably familiar. And the rolling care register as well for identifying people with Parkinson's who might be interested in this study. And we're hoping to submit for ethical review in the next week. And we're estimating that this study would begin in March. So obviously that's pending any changes from the ethical review, but we're optimistic that we'll be starting in the next few months. And so we're hoping to answer 3 questions with this study. The first one really tackles that issue that I spoke about of how common is obstructive sleep apnea. So we want to know, in the Lothian region, how common is obstructive sleep apnea and obstructive sleep apnea hypopnea syndrome in people with Parkinson's disease? So we want to know in this region. The second thing we want to answer is, within a randomized controlled trial setting, do we still see these same effects that treating people's obstructive sleep apnea when they have Parkinson's, using the CPAP therapy, might slow the progression or improve their symptoms of Parkinson's? And the third question, which is actually probably the most important for this, is long-term CPAP therapy feasible for people with Parkinson's disease? It's all very well and good to do this and to show that it has an effect, but if CPAP is not suitable, if it's difficult to use for people with Parkinson's, then people aren't going to use it. So that's what we also want to find out with this study. And it's got 2 parts to it. So the first one is a prevalence survey, and this is trying to see how common it is. The next part is the randomized controlled trial. And the sort of inclusion criteria, who can take part in these 2 parts? Again, just to sort of emphasize, in the prevalence survey, we're trying to reach as many people in the Lothian region with Parkinson's with a questionnaire. And so anyone with Parkinson's disease can take part. Whereas the randomized controlled trial, this is where we're narrowing down to people who have Parkinson's disease with obstructive sleep apnea, hypopnea syndrome, because we want to know how effective the CPAP therapy is in that group. This prevalence survey, how we're going to do it is by distributing a questionnaire to hopefully about 300 people with Parkinson's disease in the Lothian region. This will be sent to people, it will be distributed at clinics. And yeah, as I said, this is just open to anyone with Parkinson's, whether or not you think that you have obstructive sleep apnea, whether or not you have any sleep issues. We just want to know how many people in our region have sleep apnea or look like they have it. Then for the randomized control trial, there's a few parts to it. So the first one is the screening, making sure that we're getting the right people involved in the trial. So the first part of the screening is people complete that questionnaire to us, and then they're invited for an at-home sleep study, which assesses their sleep breathing. And this is using a machine which looks like the CPAP, and it basically just records your breathing for the night, and then we can see whether or not it looks like you've got obstructive sleep apnea. And so to be included and eligible for participation in this trial, you need to have clearly shown that there's moderate to severe obstructive sleep apnea. So that means that you've got over 15 breathing pauses in the night, per hour in the night. And then also you need to have daytime sleepiness. And so we'll get a measure of that from this prevalence questionnaire. Then when people are eligible, they are invited to enroll in the study. We're hoping to enroll 66 people, which then 33, they're randomized into 2 study groups of 33 people each. So the first group, people are going to get CPAP therapy. And so they're asked to use the CPAP machine every night for 12 months. And then they're also given the lifestyle advice I spoke about earlier. So losing weight or exercising more, stopping smoking, those sort of general lifestyle advice, which is shown to improve obstructive sleep apnea. The next group they've just received the lifestyle advice. So this is the control group. They don't have the CPAP. And then we're going to collect a whole lot of data. So there's 4 study visits to the clinical research facility at the Royal Infirmary. These happen at a baseline 0-month time point, at 3 months, 6 months, and 12 months. And at each study visit, there's a lot of tests that go on. So these are like the UPDRS, so tapping your fingers, stomping your feet, putting pegs in a board. We're going to test the motor function of participants. We're going to do cognitive testing and quite a few questionnaires about sleep, mood, quality of life. We will take a blood sample at each of these study visits. And the reason for that is that we want to look at blood inflammatory markers. So I said before how obstructive sleep apnea increases systemic sort of body inflammation. And we want to see how that changes in Parkinson's with the CPAP therapy. We also do a 24-hour blood pressure monitoring. Some of you might experience with your Parkinson's some blood pressure changes, like when you stand up, you feel dizzy. And we want to see, does the CPAP help with the blood pressure of people? Very importantly, we're going to collect feedback at each of these time points about what it's like to use the CPAP machine for people. And we're also going to ask for, it's called a caregiver questionnaire, but for the partner, for the sort of main person in your life, to also fill out just to see, is this beneficial for them that your sleep might be improving? And yes, so this randomized control trial, we're going to, between the CPAP group and the control group, we're going to look at how their test scores change across these 4 time points and see, okay, if there are improvements in Parkinson's symptoms, are these sustained long-term, or does it fluctuate? Do things improve? And then to see whether the CPAP therapy is actually feasible for people to use long-term, we're going to look at the compliance. So how much people use the machine, whether they use it at all, and the experience of using the machines. And the reason why this study is 12 months long, so it's a long time, I appreciate that, is that the people that take part in this study will have moderate to severe obstructive sleep apnea. And this is what would be given to them if they went to the Department of Sleep Medicine for a referral and to be assessed. So this is the standard treatment that they would receive. However, because so few people with Parkinson's are coming through, there isn't the data or information about whether long-term CPAP therapy is feasible. And at the end of the study, all participants will be under the care of the Department of Sleep Medicine and offered CPAP therapy. So I am coming to the end of the talk now, but I just wanted to highlight a couple of things about CPAP. And Renata also can answer some questions because she's worked with this equipment for many years. So how does it work? Basically, the machine, it sits on the bedside table. It takes in air just from the room and it filters it and then it pressurizes it. And it goes through this hose and to a mask. And then it just, is sort of there, constant pressure, or it adjusts slightly and you can breathe it in. And that pressure is what keeps the airway open at the back of the throat. And the machines that we use also have a little water chamber in there, which just humidifies the air. So it stops it from being very dry. And people sleep fine with these machines. If you have obstructive sleep apnea, it's incredibly good for your sleep. And of course, people in the CPAP group are not alone. They will receive instructions, guidance, troubleshooting expertise from Dr. Renata Riha. So, you can sleep easy in many ways. How big is it? Like I said, it just sits on the bedside table and it's got this long tube that connects to you. So it shouldn't be disrupting your sleep. Obviously, like anything, takes time to adjust just because it's something new in the bedroom. Do you have to wear a mask? Yes, that's how the air is delivered to the face. And the mask varieties change from you can have a full face one, which I believe is what people tend to be started on because it gets the nose and the mouth. However, if you don't get on with that, there's a few variations and there's these pure nasal ones as well. So, there's variety. And do you need to clean it? Yes, you should be cleaning this because obviously you're breathing it in, so you can clean it. I think you can go daily, once a week, just making sure it's nice and clean. And probably the most important question, which also David asked, is it noisy? So it does have a noise to it because obviously it's pressurized air. I've just put up a decibel scale here. So we're going from 0, the threshold of human hearing, up to 130, which is a gunshot. The AirSense 10 machine, which will be used in this study, comes in at, I think it's 26.6 decibels. So that is, the sound range of that is between the quiet room and a whisper. So of course there's going to be noise and it will take getting used to for yourself and if you have a bed partner, but it is not that noisy. Okay. So there we are. That's the end of the talk. Just to say that, as I said before, we expect to start distributing the study invite and the prevalence questionnaires, which are open to anyone with Parkinson's to take part in, hopefully in March. If you have questions or comments, then please do just contact myself or Dr. Riha. I've put our emails here, but also I'll make sure that David can distribute them. Sorry about my throat. And finally, thank you very much for paying attention and coming along at 10 a.m. on a Saturday morning.
Thank you, Amber. I'm going to stop recording now. And I see you've stopped sharing your screen already.